It was the kind of cold that didn't just settle into your coat, it settled into your decisions. Renata Solís had been a trauma nurse for 9 years, and she knew the difference between pain that announced itself and pain that quietly rewrote everything. The second kind was what she'd been living with since the accident on Highway 17. 3 surgeries, 18 months of physio, a parking placard she'd had to fight her own pride to accept before she finally hung it on the rearview mirror of her Civic. That night she was driving home from the end of a 12-hour shift at Queensway Regional. It was just past 2 in the morning. The roads through Brockton were glazed and empty, the streetlights turning the slush pale orange. She had her hospital badge clipped to her scrub top, her coat half open, because she'd been too tired to button it all the way. She had a thermos of cold coffee in the cup holder, and a voicemail from her mother she hadn't listened to yet. She was stopped at a red light on Dunmore Avenue when the cruiser pulled up behind her. She noticed the headlights first. Then the lights didn't turn off when the signal changed. She moved through the intersection. The cruiser followed. She signaled, turned onto Keel Street. The cruiser turned too. She checked her speed. She was 3 kilometers under the limit. She signaled again for the next street. The cruiser stayed with her, close enough that she could see the silhouette of the officer in her rearview mirror. Then the roof lit up. She pulled over immediately, both hands on the wheel, and waited. The officer was young, younger than she'd expected. He walked to her window with the slow, measured pace of someone who had already decided something before he arrived. His name tag read Holloway. Constable Holloway, Brockton Police Service. "Evening," he said. He didn't ask how she was doing. "Good evening," Renata said. She kept her voice even. She was good at that. 9 years in trauma had taught her to regulate when everything around her was coming apart. "You were swerving back there." She hadn't been. She knew she hadn't been, but she said, "I don't believe I was, but I'm happy to discuss it. Can I ask what street you first observed this?" He didn't answer that. Instead, "Have you had anything to drink tonight?" "No. You sure about that?" "I just finished a 12-hour shift. I'm a nurse at Queensway Regional." She started to reach for her badge. "Don't reach for anything," he said, sharp. She stopped, hands back on the wheel. "License registration," he said. She told him where the registration was, in the glove compartment, and asked permission before opening it. He watched her the whole time with that particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with suspicion. She handed over her documents. He studied them longer than necessary. "Step out of the vehicle, please." The cold hit her immediately. She was wearing compression socks under her scrubs because of the way her legs swelled at the end of long shifts. She had her cane in the back seat. She didn't always use it, but she'd brought it that night because her right hip had been bad all week. She reached for it. "Leave that." She looked at him. "I have a documented mobility impairment. The placard on my mirror, I need you to walk a straight line for me." She stood in the slush in her nursing clogs and looked at Constable Holloway and understood, with the clarity that only comes at 2 in the morning when you are very tired and very certain you've done nothing wrong, that this was going to become something larger than a traffic stop. "I can't walk a straight line without my cane," she said. "My right leg has a partially fused hip joint following a motor vehicle accident in 2024. I have documentation. My physician is Dr. Annette Quirk at the Brockton Rehabilitation Center. I also have my hospital ID which shows, Ma'am, I need you to comply. I am complying. I'm explaining a medical reality." He called it in, said she was being uncooperative, said she appeared impaired. She stood there in the cold and listened to him say those words about her, and she did not raise her voice. She had learned, the way a lot of women learn without anyone telling them directly, that raising her voice would only become the story. So she stood still, and she waited, and her hip ached, and the slush soaked through the canvas of her clogs, and she thought about the 12 people she had kept alive in the last 12 hours, and she said nothing. A second cruiser arrived about 8 minutes later. The officer who stepped out was older, mid-40s, maybe. She caught the name tag as he walked under the street light, Sergeant Audra Bellemare. She had gray threading through her braid and the kind of face that had seen enough to stop performing patience and just have it. She looked at Renata. She looked at the cane visible through the back window. She looked at the placard. Then she looked at Holloway. "What've we got?" Holloway gave his version. Bellemare listened without interrupting. When he was done, she walked to Renata and said, "Can I see your documentation, Ms. Solís? Renata Solís, Ms. Solís." She waited. Renata walked her through it carefully, the placard number, the hospital ID, the summary letter from Dr. Quirk, that she kept folded in her wallet because this had happened before, not like this, but adjacent to this, and she had learned to be prepared. Bellemare read the letter. She read it slowly, the way someone reads something they intend to remember. Then she said to Holloway, "Did she submit to a roadside breath test?" Holloway said she'd been uncooperative. "Did she refuse a breath test?" A pause. She was being uncooperative. Bellemare looked at him a long moment. "I'm going to need you to be more specific." The breath test was administered. Renata blew a 0. Holloway said nothing. Bellemare stood beside her and handed back her documents and said quietly, "I'm sorry for the delay, Miss Solís. You're free to go." But Renata didn't go. Not yet. "He said I was swerving," she said. "His dash cam will show I wasn't." Bellemare looked at her steadily. "It will. I want to know what happens with that footage." Bellemare pulled out a card and held it out. "If you don't hear something within 10 days, you call me directly." Renata took the card. She got back in her car. She sat there for a moment before starting the engine, hands on the wheel again, and noticed they were trembling slightly. Not from fear, from the effort of not trembling sooner. She drove home. She didn't cry until she was inside, sitting on the edge of her bathtub with her cane across her knees, still in her coat. She told herself it was fine. She told herself it was over. It wasn't over. 3 days later, she received a written notice of a formal complaint filed against her from Constable Holloway, alleging that she had obstructed a lawful traffic investigation and provided false documentation. The letter was brief and bureaucratic. It said she could expect to be contacted by the Professional Standards Unit of the Brockton Police Service. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Then she called her friend Priya, who was a paralegal, and whose voice had the particular quality of someone who had stopped being surprised by things but hadn't stopped being angry about them. "Screenshot everything," Priya said. "Every document, every date, every name. And Renata, don't talk to anyone from the department without someone there with you." "He filed a complaint against me," Renata said. "He pulled me over for nothing, made me stand in the cold without my cane, called in a false report, and he filed a complaint against me." "I know," Priya said. "I know." The Professional Standards Unit assigned an investigator named Corporal Yves Fontaine. He was polite in the way that institutions teach their people to be polite. Just warm enough to create the impression of fairness. He asked her to come in and give a recorded statement. She brought Priya. Fontaine asked about the stop, about her behavior, about whether she had at any point raised her voice or used language that could be characterized as threatening. She answered everything clearly and factually and watched him write things down in a notebook that he held at an angle she couldn't read. At the end, he said he'd be in touch. He said these things took time. She asked about the dashcam footage. He said they were reviewing it. She asked about Holloway's body camera. He said they were reviewing it. She went home and found a message from the nursing college, not a formal complaint yet, but a flag. Someone had submitted an anonymous concern about her fitness to practice. It listed the traffic stop as evidence of erratic behavior and possible substance impairment at the time of operation of a motor vehicle. She sat down on her kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about quitting. Not because she wanted to, but because she understood suddenly what was happening. Not a single incident, but a campaign, small and deliberate, designed to make her too exhausted to keep going. She had seen it happen to others. She had watched colleagues make that calculation, is this worth what it costs to fight it? She thought about the woman who had come into her trauma bay 6 months ago, a retired postal worker, 63 years old, who had driven herself to the hospital at midnight with a ruptured appendix because she didn't want to make a fuss. Renata had held her hand while they prepped her for emergency surgery and told her firmly that making a fuss was sometimes the most important thing a person could do. She got up off the floor. She started a document, date, time, name, event, witness, if applicable. She went back to the beginning and reconstructed every detail she could remember, what she had been wearing, the exact temperature reading on her Civic's dashboard, the angle of the streetlight, the number on Holloway's badge, the precise wording Bellemare had used when she'd said Renata was free to go. She wrote for 3 hours. She wrote until the document was 14 pages. Then she requested copies of her medical records going back 18 months. She contacted Dr. Quirk's office and asked for a formal letter of verification. She pulled her original accident report, her surgical records, the physio discharge summary, the OHIP documentation for the placard. She organized everything into a binder with labeled tabs. She called Bellemare. Bellemare answered on the second ring. "The footage," Renata said. "Has professional standards reviewed it?" A pause. Not the pause of someone checking, the pause of someone choosing words. "Monsieur Solís," Bellemare said, "I want you to know that I submitted a detailed written account of what I observed that night within 24 hours of the incident. That account is on file." Renata understood what Bellemare wasn't saying. "The footage," she said again. "Is it intact?" Another pause. "I can't speak to the status of evidence in an active review, Sergeant Bellemare. Yes or no, did you see the dashcam footage before you submitted your account?" "I submitted based on direct observation," Bellemare said carefully. "What I personally saw." Renata wrote that down. Exact phrasing. She found a lawyer 3 weeks later. Not through a referral from anyone at the hospital, because she'd learned quickly that institutional loyalty had a ceiling, and she was now above it. She found him through a community legal clinic in the East End. His name was Marcus Kowalczyk. He was quiet and methodical and had spent 11 years doing civil rights work in Ontario. He had a neat stack of similar case files on his desk, and when she walked in and put her binder on the table, he looked at it and said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" 3 nights, she said. He nodded slowly. "Good." Kowalczyk filed a formal complaint with the Office of the Independent Police Review Director. He also filed a request under FIPPIA, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, for all documentation related to the stop, including both camera feeds. The request was acknowledged. A timeline of up to 30 days was cited. On day 27, the department reported that Holloway's body camera had malfunctioned that evening and no footage existed. On day 29, they reported that the dash cam footage was under review and could not be released while the internal investigation remained open. Kowalczyk was not surprised. Renata was not surprised either, which was its own kind of grief, the grief of watching something unfair happen and not being shocked by it. "We have Bellemare's account," Kowalczyk said. "That's significant. She's a 22-year veteran with a clean record. Her written account directly contradicts Holloway's narrative. Will she testify?" He was quiet a moment. "She submitted documentation voluntarily. That's already notable. Whether she's willing to go further, that's her decision." Renata thought about that. About what it cost to be the person who submitted the paperwork no one asked for. About what it cost to keep being that person. She called Bellemare again. It was a Sunday afternoon, and she wasn't sure the sergeant would pick up. She picked up. "I wanted to thank you," Renata said, "for the written account." Bellemare was quiet for a moment. "I wrote down what I saw. I know. I'm still thanking you." A longer pause. "Then my daughter is a nurse, works at CHIO in Ottawa." She said it without elaboration. She didn't need to. "I see," Renata said. "The footage issue," Bellemare said. "I don't know what happened with the body cam. What I do know is that I reviewed the dash cam footage the morning after the stop. It was clear. There was no swerving." Renata's hand tightened around the phone. "I'm writing that down," she said. "You should," Bellemare said. What came next was slow and then sudden, which is how most things that matter tend to move. Kowalczyk filed a supplementary statement from Bellemare, formal, witnessed, dated. He cross-referenced it with the FIPPA timeline, noting that Bellemare had reviewed the footage before the department claimed it was unavailable for release. He submitted a formal request to the OIPRD to expand the scope of the investigation to include possible evidence handling misconduct. The nursing college dropped their flag. Kowalczyk had sent them the full documentation package, the medical records, the placard verification, the breath test results, Bellemare's account, and whoever had reviewed it had apparently found the anonymous concern insufficient to proceed. Renata got the letter on a Tuesday. She was in the break room at Queensway when it came through on her phone. She read it, put her phone down, picked up her thermos, and went back to work. She had 2 patients in recess who needed her. The OIPRD investigation took 4 months. It was not fast, and it was not clean, and there were weeks when Renata went to work and came home and sat with her binder and felt the particular exhaustion of a fight that has no dramatic moments, only documents and waiting. Holloway remained on active duty for the first 3 months. Then, quietly, he was moved to a desk assignment. The department said it was routine. Kowalczyk noted the timing in a letter to the OIPRD. The hearing was held in March. It was not a courtroom. It was a review board, a long table in a municipal building that smelled of old carpet and central heating. Renata sat beside Kowalczyk and opposite 2 members of the OIPRD and a representative from the police service. Holloway was present with his union representative. Bellemare was called as a witness. Bellemare walked in wearing her dress uniform. She sat down, stated her name and rank and years of service, and she told the board exactly what she had seen on Dunmore Avenue and exactly what she had reviewed on dashcam footage the morning of December 8th. She used precise language. She did not embellish. She did not hedge. She answered every question directly, and she looked at the board, not at Holloway. When she was done, the room was very quiet. The board asked Holloway to explain the discrepancy between his report and Bellemare's account. He said there had been a miscommunication. He said the conditions were difficult. He said he had been acting in good faith. The board asked about the dashcam footage. There was a pause. His union rep leaned over and said something quietly. Holloway said he couldn't speak to that. The OIPRD findings were released 6 weeks later. The board found that Constable Holloway had engaged in conduct unbecoming an officer, that his report had contained material inaccuracies, and that there was reasonable cause to believe the subsequent complaint against Ms. Solís had been filed in bad faith. The board recommended termination and referral to the Crown for review of possible obstruction charges. The department accepted the findings. Renata was at home when Kowalczyk called. She was making tea, and she turned off the burner and stood in her kitchen and listened, and when he finished, she said, "Thank you," and hung up and stood there for another minute looking at the window, at the March light, coming through at an angle that was almost warm. She thought about what she would do with this. Not with the outcome specifically, but with all of it. The binder, the 14 pages, the Sunday phone call, the standing in the cold without her cane while someone called her uncooperative for having a body that worked the way it worked. She picked up her phone and called Priya. "It's done," she said. Priya let out a long breath. "How do you feel?" Renata thought about it honestly, not the way you answer when someone asks how you're doing, but the real version. "I feel like I shouldn't have had to do any of it," she said, "and I feel like I'd do all of it again." 3 months after the OIPRD decision, the Brockton Police Services Board adopted new mandatory protocols for traffic stops, involving individuals displaying accessibility placards or mobility devices. A clear language requirement to allow the individual to retrieve any necessary medical or mobility equipment before any field sobriety assessment, and a supervisor notification requirement for any stop that resulted in a formal complaint against the individual stopped. They were small changes. They were not the kind of changes that made headlines, because the story of a policy update is harder to tell than the story of a confrontation, and because small changes are easy to overlook until you are the person standing in the slush at 2 in the morning and you discover that someone somewhere already fought for you. Renata went back to work. She had a night shift on a Thursday in June, the kind that moved fast from the start. 2 traumas in the first hour, a pediatric code that resolved cleanly, a man in his 70s who came in conscious and talking and was gone by 4 in the morning despite everything they did. She clocked out just after 7, walked to her car in the early light, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her cane was in the back seat. Her badge was clipped to her scrub top. Her placard hung on the rearview mirror catching the morning sun. She drove home. She listened to her mother's voicemail. She stopped for coffee. She was still tired. She was still a person who would have to fight for things that should not require fighting. But she was also still here, still working, still the person who told patients in the middle of the night that making a fuss was sometimes the most important thing a person could do. She believed it. She had the paperwork to prove it.